everyone, and welcome to Blunt Business. I'm your host, Sean Eubanks, and we are here with STRAINWISE Consulting's General Counsel and Cannabis Insider and Attorney, Jay Kotzker.
Hey, how you doing, Sean?
Doing well. Thank you so much for showing back up and being here. It's such a great thing that you're doing every week for us, condensing all of the marijuana news and what it means to us politically, socially, and financially, and how it helps or hurts our business.
Absolutely. There's a lot going on out there.
Absolutely. So let's dive in. First up, publicly traded global tobacco company gets in the cannabis game.
That's right. It's a company called Alliance One International. Stock ticker is AOI. They are a contractor, a processor, producer of tobacco plants. They just recently announced, as of last week, that they were taking controlling stakes in 2 Canadian cannabis companies, as well as a 40% stake in a North Carolina-based hemp company.
And so we know previously that Constellation Brands invested in Canopy Growth, another Canadian company. What's different in what tobacco's doing versus what Constellation's brand did?
I don't know if it's that much different. I think what you're seeing here is they're taking a controlling interest in those cannabis cultivation operations in Canada. It's important to note one of those is already a licensed cultivator. One of them has an application pending, though they expect that to be approved here very soon. Their 3-year growth plan on those 2 facilities is to bring it up to 1 million square feet of cultivation space. So they obviously have the agricultural background and techniques and processes in place, and they're looking to use that and leverage that in a new and emerging market.
And so that's for indoor growing in Canada, obviously. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts on big tobacco, the rumors there of them ready to convert hip farms overnight almost?
Yeah, I don't know if they're necessarily quite there yet. I don't know if they understand how the hemp is going to expand on a huge agricultural industrial level. But I think that if anybody is poised to move industry sectors, it's the tobacco companies.
And so do you anticipate more expansion, or do you think just this is just one example of a tobacco company getting involved? Do you see that happening in the States, or do we need to wait for federal legalization first?
Yeah, I think the reason that you see them moving into Canada is because it is legal on the federal level, that they have a little bit more certainty in the ownership and operation of those companies, and why they are moving into the hemp sector here in the States, even though there's some dispute on the legality of the hemp, and there's court cases going on right now talking about that. But that's a way that they can kind of dip their toe in the water, so to speak, here in the U.S. and still kind of get into the industry without owning a plant, a marijuana, cannabis, THC high plant touching company.
And so we have tobacco betting big on cannabis. Now we have some interesting information from the alcohol industry as well.
That's right. So this is, the point is that there are other industries are taking note of cannabis. It's not simply something that's being left unnoticed and it's just kind of growing and percolating on its own. You have industry titans moving into the space, taking note of it. You mentioned Constellation Brands. Mm-hmm. We're also seeing Molson Coors just last week in a 10-K that they filed with the SEC indicated that cannabis is a risk factor in their growing company, in their growing revenues, because they're going to be competing for dollars with cannabis companies. And we've already seen that states that have adult use programs generally have seen a decline in alcohol purchases. You've also seen French alcohol producer just mentioned recently that everybody in the industry is taking note of the cannabis sector as something that could be vying for their discretionary spending dollars.
And something, along the Canada lines there, I think it's fascinating that Molson Coors is moving in. That's a bullish sign there. But also reports that Canadian consumers now are consuming as much cannabis as wine. Mm-hmm. That is something I would never have predicted.
No, certainly not, especially in the kind of infancy of cannabis legalization, especially in Canada. But it's certainly indicative of how fast the public acceptance is growing for that.
All right, next up, Leafly is removing unlicensed cannabis dispensaries from its dispensary finder tool.
That's right. So Leafly, for those that are not necessarily familiar with it, is an online website that provides strain reviews. It provides dispensary location finder tools. It provides a lot of information about cannabis and the cannabis industry. They had, for a number of years, included unlicensed dispensaries, based out of California, in their finder tool. If you're in California, you want to find a dispensary that's near you, You open the Leafly app or website, and it would show all of these unlicensed dispensaries. They are now taking the step to start removing those unlicensed dispensaries from their search tool.
And this is a big deal because this is largely about California. You'd be hard-pressed to find a dispensary operator or cultivator, anybody in the cannabis space outside of California that was operating without a license. It's just rare. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but it's definitely not a prevailing thing that you see over and over again. So it's all about California. Leafly's doing what they can to help people become compliant and send the message, because in all fairness to California, they just didn't know. There's been such a gray area for a long time. There's probably a lot of people are waiting to say, hey, are they going to enforce this? Now we know that they are.
Right. I think Leafly certainly isn't the one enforcing state law, but I think this is a move that is in conjunction with what they're seeing overall in the state, is that the state and local municipalities are moving in and very aggressively shutting down unlicensed, non-compliant operators. I don't know what this will do for Leafly's, revenue in the short term, because it's going to be taking away, some advertising dollars from dispensaries that normally would be spending on a monthly basis with them, until we get to the point where there's more dispensaries that are licensed and back on the platform.
And you're working top to bottom in the state of California, licensing everything from delivery to distribution to micro businesses, of course, dispensaries and cultivation. This is a chance for people to reach out to you and in a very affordable way, go ahead and get their license so that they can become listed back on Leafly.
That's right. We help people that are existing operators that were working in the gray market. We help them get their licenses and get legal. We help new entrepreneurs that want to get into the market identify local jurisdictions that match their needs and their preferences, and then help them get their local and state licenses as well.
All right, this next one's all about MedMen. Can a U.S. cannabis company really be worth $1 billion?
That's right. So MedMen, another California-based company, it's a plant-touching, U.S. cannabis company, and they just recently received, a non-binding LOI, which we all love, non-binding LOI, but it was for a $30 million investment for a 3% stake in the company. So that, is a rough valuation of $1 billion, which is jaw-dropping.
You don't have to answer this, but if you can, shed some light on it. Are you concerned at all about these non-binding LOIs and what it does to the stock and issues potentially lying with the SEC, a way for them to kind of penetrate and get involved and mess things up?
We don't know all the facts of this. I would say that they're very confident that the parties are going to move forward, or they wouldn't have issued a press release talking about this non-binding LOI. That's certainly their prerogative. Other companies, have different views on whether to issue press releases like that. But I imagine that the intent to move forward between the parties is very legitimate. The question I have is, how do you value a company like this at $1 billion?
Right.
MedMen is a company that has assets in California, Nevada, and New York. They also provide operational support for a number of clients around the country. But does that alone equate to a $1 billion valuation? I don't know.
Right, and what type of IP do they have, if any, and how is that defendable? There's a lot of unanswered questions there.
Sure, and you see people around the industry all the time that have a very difficult time determining how to value a cannabis company, right? We see transactions happening all the time, and valuations are all over the board. So like you mentioned, looking at hard assets. So what's your IP portfolio look like? What do your actual licensed assets look like? Because those are real tangible assets that you can put a value on. But it's very difficult. It's very difficult to value a company, especially when you're looking at entities operating in different states that have different regulatory structures, different levels of how much a public company or certain owners can be involved in the company. So it's the lack of uniformity could make this valuation process very difficult.
Yeah, so we're rooting for MedMen. We hope they're doing it right and they can hold that valuation and everything works well. We've seen a couple of companies throughout the industry since the inception here get high valuations and then just start to tank or trail, and things start to happen. So hopefully MedMen is confident that they're bringing in a lot of capital and they have some success there.
Absolutely, and what it shows you also is that there are significant investment dollars out there looking to be brought in, not only into the Canadian market, but obviously into the U.S. as well.
Speaking of, Colorado's still growing. Colorado cannabis sales hit a record $1.5 billion in 2017.
That's right. So, this comes on the heels of reports coming out of our home state of Colorado mentioning that, recreational sales are kind of plateauing off. Though in 2017, we just hit a new record. There was a 990 some odd million in 2015, 1.3 billion in 2016, and we're up to 1.5 billion in 2017. So the market continues to grow. It's a staggering amount of sales. almost 1.1 million of this, or 1.1 billion of this, is related to adult use. So you see the drastic disparity between adult use revenues and a shrinking medical market.
Yeah, and you have conversations with clients all the time about this, having them understand the evolution of the medical as a start, and then what recreational and how long it takes. We have about a 3-year period where recreational marijuana in Colorado caught up to medical, and you see a declining renewal of medical cards and things like that. Simply the free market addressing the needs of those patients.
Right, and it's the supply in Colorado and elsewhere on the recreational side has kind of caught up, so that the prices are now coming down. And even though that consumers are paying taxes on their recreational marijuana, oftentimes it is generally a wash with what they're going to spend on their medical marijuana. So why go through the process of keeping a medical marijuana registration card, keeping a relationship with a primary health care provider and all of that, when you could just walk in and buy it on the recreational side?
Yeah, another key indicator here is who's buying this, right? I know a lot of people by now, everyone understands the political climate, and the demand and the overall approval for marijuana in the United States is overwhelming. But we see this example from New Mexico and some of sort of the bordering towns of Colorado. Talk about that and the surprising consumption where people are basically crossing the border.
Right, so obviously the highest revenue dollars are coming from the kind of population hubs of Denver and Arapahoe counties here in Colorado, and that would be expected. Mm-hmm. What is a little surprising is that 3 out of the 5 counties that had the highest per capita sales are located on Colorado's southern border with New Mexico. Los Animas County is one of them, and it has a per capita sale of a little over $3,000 for every adult and child in the county, which seems to indicate that you're having a lot of cross-border revenue coming in. So residents of New Mexico or other places outside of Colorado coming into Colorado, making purchases, and then hopefully staying here or keeping all the product here. We don't want to raise the ire of the federal government any more than we already do.
Right, so buy it here, consume it here, you should be fine. Another example of what Massachusetts is probably doing, and we're seeing a lot of the clients of ours start to recognize that. So you see a lot of activity in the Berkshires area, the western part of the state, because they understand people are going to cross over and access cannabis from the other states.
Right, and so what you would hopefully see is that New Mexico is looking at this saying, hey, Colorado is really benefiting from our residents crossing the border, making purchases for adult use cannabis in a state where that's legal. Why don't we keep that revenue here? So maybe that pushes them to start continuing the discussion and the evaluation of an adult use program of their own.
Absolutely. All right, on the federal level, federal cases to watch: Alexis Bortell versus Jeff Sessions.
That's right. This is one of 3 important cases in the cannabis industry this week. This one is in a federal district court in New York. Alexis Bortell, a 12-year-old girl, along with a number of other plaintiffs, including former NFL players, some combat veterans suffering from PTSD, and others, are challenging the constitutionality of the Schedule I designation that cannabis has.
And probably the most popular or well-known of these cases is Alexis Bortell, who was, as a child, having epilepsy and having seizures in Texas. She moved to Colorado where she could access her medicine. That was working fine. The challenge came up when she couldn't take her cannabis oil across different states and travel with it. Obviously, detrimental health effects to her and very painful experiences her and her family are going through simply by not taking what is actually medicine from border to border.
That's right, and it applied to the combat veterans as well, who had made the argument that traveling to a VA hospital, traveling to a government agency, doing other things like that with the cannabis medicine that they have is resulting in them committing a felony, right? And they're basically arguing that back in 1970, when the Controlled Substances Act was passed, that there was a lot more unknown about cannabis at the time, and whether there were political pushes at the time to include cannabis to tamp down a little bit of civil unrest due to Vietnam War. That we can get into that argument, but
sure.
The point is, this hasn't really been tested since the mid 70s. And now there's a lot more research, and the judge in this case even recognized that the patients are seeing an actual medical benefit from cannabis, which is probably the first time that a federal judge has ever said that.
Yeah, and so you got to think, as we learn more about PTSD and those who actually have it and the consequences of it, it comes on radically. It comes on quickly. It's a problem. So going a day or two without oil, simply not an option, especially those who are actively suffering with PTSD. Also the ramifications of possibly being a felon. And I don't know exactly how that affects your benefits as a veteran, but I imagine there's something that goes on with that.
Sure.
Obviously you don't want a lot of kids like Alexis Bortell racking up felonies as a young kid, but this is wonderful progress that they've made, but this is a long fight.
Oh, absolutely. So yesterday's hearing was actually a hearing on a motion to dismiss filed by the U.S. government, basically claiming, hey, look, we heard this same argument back in 1973 in the Kiffer case. It basically ruled that, you know, the CSA and cannabis's schedule as a Schedule I narcotic is constitutionally valid, so why are we even here? Obviously, the plaintiff's argument is, hey, people's perceptions of things and people's ideas change over time. If you know, we shouldn't be judging cases today based on what people thought in 1970, right? Otherwise, we wouldn't have cases like Brown versus Board of Education and others, right? We're socially progressive, and our case law should probably match what the public sentiment is. Interestingly, though, the judge really feels, even though he seems very sympathetic to the plaintiffs in this case, I think he's caught in a very difficult spot because his job is to interpret the laws and, you know, their constitutionality or legality. And so he even made the statement, hey, while I sympathize with you guys, this is probably not the best forum to do that. We have regulatory agencies that can make these designations, namely the DEA. You should go petition them, which is difficult because working through that administrative process can take, you know, 9 years is what the plaintiffs in this case are averaging that it would take to do that. So it's a little bit of a dichotomy there. Like, the judge recognizes that social progress needs to be made in this area, but at the same time, he's a little hamstrung to do much about it.
And so, of course, this leads to political climate, right, where the DEA has historically said, oh, no, let Congress handle that, right? So maybe it goes to the DEA, time elapses, there's obviously, these are real medical issues. They kick it back to Congress. You're starting to see a lot of Democrats now. I think it's better for the country if we have a close midterm race, because you're seeing Democrats step out and say, I'm going to run on a single issue, and that is marijuana legalization, and that seems to be getting some traction.
Absolutely, especially now that, you know, we've got a CR, continuing resolution for federal spending through March 23rd. During this time, you know, Congress is working on a long-term spending bill. We're hearing that it's a 2-year bill. I know that there's a bipartisan group of congressmen that are working to include protections for the cannabis industry, not just on the medical side, but on the adult use side as well. So hopefully this is an opportunity for, you know, this case to highlight the need for the legislature to really get involved and do something and spur those people into action.
Absolutely. Hopefully that works out. Well, Jay Kotzker, thank you so much for joining us on this edition of the High Five. It has been informative as usual, and I want to thank you all for joining us.
High five.